Hello, everyone. This is Joe from Sound Devices. Thank you for joining me today for a very special in-action story. I'm joined by sound effects recordist, sound editor, and re-recording mixer Alex Knickerbocker. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to be on.
Yeah. So Alex was recently involved in a very cool record-breaking shoot. But before we dig into that, can you give us a little bit of background on your work?
Sure. So I've been working in the sort of major studios for roughly the last 10 years. Have been doing sound effects recording, curation, mastering, and database management for a number of the major studios around Los Angeles here. And basically, any time a film or a television show needs some interesting sounds to go along with picture, I'm one of the guys that gets contacted and runs out recording things like cars or aircraft or backgrounds or doors or anything like that. So it's been sort of a behind the scenes work that I've been doing, and that's kind of what led me to our shoot today.
Nice. So tell us about the shoot with SSC North America.
Certainly. So this was effectively an attempt to break the land speed record for a production vehicle, and there is a whole world unto that we could spend hours talking on just by itself. But effectively, it's one of the most competitive areas of the automotive market, and the record was previously held by a company called Koenigsegg. And there was an unofficial, I guess not unofficial, but sort of an attempt by Bugatti to break that record as well, as far as fastest production vehicles. So I got a call from a producer that I've worked with in the past saying there's going to be an attempt by this company SSC with their vehicle, the Tuatara, and we'd love to document the whole process, and we'd love to get the sounds of the vehicle and the sounds of the production. So come on out.
Why is this such a big deal in the hypercar industry?
Well, you can think of the hypercar world kind of like what NASA is to sort of the general public, in my opinion. It's a lot of innovation happens at the upper levels of the automotive side with hypercars, and you see a lot of the technology that they develop kind of trickle down into sort of normal production vehicles. It's very much kind of an R&D ground, and also a really competitive racing area of the automotive world too. And in the past few years, honestly over I think over a decade at this point, the fastest production vehicles in the world have all been companies outside the US. So this is kind of a big deal because the United States has not had a hypercar that has attained this record over a European vehicle or over a foreign vehicle for a long time. So this is sort of an attempt at taking that mantle back. And it's just a high pressure, high stakes area.
Question, we can get into some gear. What's the gear setup like for a shoot? And then how are you capturing onboard sounds versus things like drive-bys?
Sure. So it varies from vehicle to vehicle. And in this situation, I was the only sound person to come out and actually capture all of the sonic vocabulary of the car. Usually with a car shoot, you want a number of recordists out there with a number of recorders and perspectives and all that. So this was kind of unique because it was still an effort to make that level of recording happen, but just with a single person. And that in mind, I ended up bringing out 3 recorders and a bunch of different microphones just to make sure that anything that managed to come up during the shoot, I was able to kind of plan for and work around, because there's always something that goes crazy. There's always some unexpected thing that comes up. So just having enough gear out there to manage that, make sure that you've got a little bit of redundancy. That was kind of the goal. So in this case, I had a Sound Devices MixPre-10 II. I had actually a rented Sound Devices 688, and I had the new 833 as well. For the onboard recordings, I used a couple of lavalier microphones. Those are basically the only microphones that are really small enough to get into all the various places that you need them. And in this particular instance, because these cars are so specific in how they're constructed and they're trying to attain speeds that no ordinary vehicle would, aerodynamics really come into play. You can't do an ordinary mic setup of, mounting a whole system to the back of the car and running, larger dynamic mics on the exhaust. You basically are limited to just lavalier mics that are as flush as possible with the rest of the vehicle and your cabling and everything. So I had a couple of Voice Technologies lavaliers out there to do both the onboards, the interior of the engine compartment, as well as the exhaust. And I'm actually really happy with how those turned out. They're sort of in the realm of the DPAs or the Sonkins of the world, and they have some really robust microphones that are heat resistant with their cabling. So that was kind of why I wanted to go after them. And I later learned that the interior of the engine compartment into the exhaust actually heated up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 degrees during the recording. And these mics worked fine. I think they were outside of that, serious heat, but you get all that bleed, you get all that runoff of heat energy. So it was really important to have pretty robust equipment out there. And for the exterior pass-bys, I was using a couple of Sennheiser 8040s in a very, very big spaced array so that I could get the in of the car as it went by as well as a long out, because a lot of the character of the exhaust happens when you're, facing a microphone as the car is driving away. And then I had a shotgun microphone. I actually was testing out a microphone called the Deity S-Mic 2, which is sort of a competitor with the Sennheiser 416 or the Rode NTG3. And I'm pretty impressed with how it came out. That was something, again, I just kind of decided to test it out to see how it sounded on something really demanding. And pretty much all of the gear that I was using out there performed exactly as I'd hoped. And I got really excited about that because it was just apart from one thing, the ideal situation to be in.
I'm sure, all these engineers, when they're building this car, they see out there, and you're mounting microphones onto their machine that they've taken so long to build. I'm sure they kind of get a little protective.
It's, this is a multi-million-dollar vehicle that's all carbon fiber construction, and it's about to make an attempt at a world record. If you look at it wrong, people are going to get, a little sketched out by it. So you do have to be very careful. And that's why whenever I'm taping microphones down, at this point, any vehicle that I work on, I'm using painter's tape and I'm using masking tape because it's much more gentle on the surface of the vehicle. I've kind of gotten away from using any kind of gaff tape or duct tape or anything like that, just because you never know. So it worked out perfectly. I brought a bunch of different colors of tape so that they can blend with the car if that's necessary for any reason. Because when you're working against a production and you're trying to record all these sound effects and trying to get all this stuff done, you never know what's going to show up on camera while you're trying to capture this workup, if you're trying to capture at the same time. So it ended up being really important to have gentle tape that was able to mount everything solidly too.
Alex and I had spoken a little bit while he was out during the shoot. We were really excited to bring him in for the story. And while we were talking, you mentioned you had some power issues that were going on.
Sure. So this was a distant location shoot, way out in the middle of the desert off by Amargosa Valley and Death Valley, kind of on the Cal-Nevada border. And I got out there after testing all of this gear out 4 or 5 times before I even hit the road. I arrived at the location and, got into the hotel room, tested the gear again before I went to bed the previous night. 5 minutes before the call time, the power junction of my main recorder failed. And that was the one thing that I did not have a backup for. It was a piece of rental gear that I think, there's no real way to keep track of how much abuse that particular thing sees. So it ended up being a scramble literally as the first day started to try and get all this, the same level of professional quality audio done without the main recorder that I was going to use. So I ended up actually swapping the 688 out for the MixPre-10 II. And I'm pretty impressed. It literally saved the entire first day of the shoot. And I didn't have any power issues. I didn't have any sound quality issues. And I was able to record everything with the 32-bit floating point protocols that you guys have built in. And that allowed me to swap between production dialogue, which is very quiet in comparison to this crazy hypercar that we're recording as well, and use the same recorder without really worrying about levels back and forth to swap in and out as I needed. And that really, I didn't anticipate that that was what was going to fail. You know, again, I brought out multiple recorders specifically just in case something like this did happen. But I didn't anticipate that it was going to be power. I figured maybe a memory card or a couple of microphones or cables or something like that. So having such a fantastic and comparable level of professional quality out of that recorder, and then the 32-bit floating point on top of it, literally couldn't have done this without it.
Yeah, that's great. So you've done lots of car recordings. I know you just mentioned how the MixPre-10 II helped in. Are you finding that 32-bit float protocol essentially is helping with these recordings?
Well, it's interesting because, the short answer is yes. But when it comes to doing car workups that you have the time to get really, really, meticulously done, I find myself setting levels in a way that I wouldn't have to use 32-bit floating point, just because I'm really paying attention to where limiters are kicking in versus not, how levels are being set, and I have time to test everything before really setting up to record. In this case, working against a production, that's one of the big challenges. You don't have that time to test anything. So at that point with 32-bit floating point, I don't have to worry about the levels that I would ordinarily spend a good 15, 20 minutes dialing in on each microphone. I can just throw the recorder in, and I'm only limited by however much SPL the mics can take. And those are pretty robust mics, and the placement I had with them didn't overmodulate them or anything. So it was a really, really, I wouldn't say it was something that I absolutely needed in this case, but it allowed me to totally free up that time that I would have taken by not worrying about it at all and being able to trust that these recorders were able to do what they needed to do without me thinking.
So you also had an 833 on the shoot. Where did you use the 833 versus the MixPre-10 II?
So for the car workup specifically, the MixPre-10 II was all onboards for the rest of the time that I was recording. Once I got the power issue solved, the 688 became the exterior pass-by recorder. And that's where I had my multiple different mics set up across, sort of a large array so that I could get the car going in, a good solid pass by with a gear shift or maybe a slight maneuver, and then the out perspective from another one of the 8040s that just really captured the life of the exhaust as the car passed and, went down the rest of the run. The 833 was my carry-on that I ran around with and was getting all of the accessories. So anything from, car starting, driving away, to doors, to windows opening and closing. This is a very, very customized and specific vehicle. There's only really one of them in the world right now. And so it's got a very unique sound to it. And with the 833, it was actually really great because those are honestly the quietest mobile preamps I've ever used. So I was able to jump back and forth between, all right, I need to get this, crazy exhaust sound that doesn't sound anything like any other car that I've ever recorded and is unbelievably loud, to, all right, I've got to get the servo of the door opening and closing. It's such a contrast, but being able to crank the preamps way up to still get a full featured sound of something so quiet and not have to worry about preamp noise, it excelled there. I was extremely happy with how the 833 performed.
It's great. So you've mentioned that you were doing not only sort of the sound effects capture, but you're working on a production. How did you kind of juggle those two jobs as they were going?
So having multiple recorders obviously really helped with that because, for the vehicle onboards, I was able to throw a recorder in and just kind of leave it as is, and it would do its job as necessary, capturing the maneuvers of the vehicle. I used the 688 for most of the production sound after we got the power issue solved, and I had a couple of Electrosonics wireless systems out there, so it was a good all-around, kind of workhorse bag. And then when it came to, again, more mobile stuff, I was running around with the 833. So it was kind of swapping in and out between all these different recorders as each day went. And allowing them to serve, each of their purposes as far as the sound effects recording went, but having a dedicated workhorse system, bag, etc., to just production audio was really, really helpful in order to actually make all this happen.
Yeah, that's cool. I can imagine that having, one specific for each, really helps. It's cool that the MixPre-10 II also was, that might be one of the fastest MixPres that the world's ever seen. The onboard one going that quick.
That's it's entirely possible.
Alex, I actually don't have any more questions. So thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Thank you for trusting all of our gear to get, this monumental shoot done. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for making it, because again, I don't know that I would have been able to trust much other gear with something as unique and as special as this. So I was fortunate to be a part of it, and I'm glad that Sound Devices was able to carry the day.
All right. Well, thanks again. For more information on Alex's work, you can check out the links that we'll have below. Thanks, and we'll see you next time for another Sound Devices in Action story.